Hello, welcome back to Intro to Programming, and welcome to your second day of JavaScript. All right, so today our focus is going to be variables. Now, what does that mean? Well, we're about to find out. So again, hopefully you've downloaded this file either from Google Classroom or from your email. Don't forget that it needs to be extracted. So I'm going to right-click, choose Extract All. I'm going to hit Extract. Yes, these are the files I need, but I like to stay organized, so I'm just going to X this out for right now. Then I'm going to delete the zipped version because I don't need this anymore. Once I've got it unzipped, I can throw away the zip version. I can open up my folder. You're going to see that there's 4 pictures in here. We'll see what those happy children are doing in a little bit. And right now we want to open variable demo. So I'm going to start by right-clicking and choosing Edit with Notepad++. So that I can see the actual code. And then I'm going to choose View in Chrome. All right, so pretty plain page, but I have 3 buttons. All right, if I click Quick Text, it says Hi. If I click it again, nothing happens. If I click Count Up, it tells me the number is 1. If I click it again, it tells me 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And I'm sure some of you right now are like doing this really hard, like, it'll just keep going. I mean, you can do it as long as you want. It's just going to keep going, but have fun with it. And if I click count down, we'll go back down. Now, I know the question you're asking, is this program crazy enough that it can handle negative numbers? It is. I'm a programming genius. I can do negative and positive numbers. It's okay to be jealous. I'm almost jealous of myself. All right, so what's happening here? How are we making this magic happen? How can you learn how to make this magic happen? Let's take a look at the code. All right, so first things first, I'm going to run through the HTML. Down here, we have a body. We have the button that calls the function quick text. We have a button that calls counting up. We have a button that calls counting down. We have a paragraph tag with the ID message. And we have a paragraph tag with the ID count num. All right, so we're actually going to start with the counting up and the counting down. Now, let's go up here to our JavaScript. So we have a comment here that says, these are the 2 variables my program will use. So when we're creating a variable in JavaScript, we start with var lowercase, all lowercase. And I know what you're thinking, slow down, Mr. Bona. I don't even know what a variable is. That's a fair question. All right, so a variable is basically the memory of the program. It's how we keep track of information. All right, last class when we set up those buttons, the buttons performed an action, but they had no idea what the current state of the page was. So like when I hit the deactivate button, it didn't know whether part 1 was activated or part 2 was activated or if nothing was activated. It just ran a command. It was like, okay, fine. I don't really care what the page looks like. I'm going to run the command as is. And if it's a waste of time, it's a waste of time, so be it. All right, it didn't allow us to keep track of anything. All right, variables are going to suddenly allow us to keep track of things. All right, it's going to allow us to keep track of information that we might want to use or employ inside of our program. All right, and that was just some OCD spacing that I had to do there. So I have this variable called text counter, and I'm setting it equal to 0. All right, when you're setting variables, the variable always has to go on the left side. Whatever you're setting it to goes on the right side. All right, I always say equal, but this is really what's called an assignment operator, and I'm assigning 0 to the variable text counter. I'm assigning 0 to the variable counter. If I were to flip the order and put the 0 on the left and the variable on the right, the program wouldn't run. It would give me an error. Okay. So when you're creating variables, it starts with var. The name of the variable can be whatever you want. Can't start with numbers. Can't have a space in it. but it can have numbers in it, just not at the start. So I could call this text counter 1, text counter 2, text counter 3. That's all fine. I just can't call it to text counter. That would not be okay. And then the var is sort of like old school algebra when you had to do let statements. All right, this is basically saying let there be a variable text counter, let there be a variable counter. In the future, I won't have to use var. Once I've done var once at the top, I never have to use var again. It's just the very first time when I'm creating the variable. I'm basically saying, hey, let there be a variable called text counter, let there be a variable called counter, and then from that point forward, I can use those in my program wherever I want. All right. So let's take a look at counter 1, or counting up. So what it does is it takes my variable counter. And again, I don't have to use var anymore because I used it once at the top. And it says counter now equals counter plus 1. So again, this is the assignment operator. So what I'm doing is I'm assigning the variable counter whatever used to be in counter plus 1 more. All right, so if counter started off at 0, it's going to be 0 plus 1, and then that's going to get stored in counter. So the next time I click on it, there's going to be a 1 in there, so it's going to be 1 plus 1, and a 2 is going to get stored in counter. And then the next time I click on it, it's going to be 2 plus 1, and a 3 is going to get stored in counter. But it's taking whatever the old value was, adding 1 to it, and then assigning it back into the variable. Just like before, the calculation has to go on the right. The variable has to go on the left by itself. All right, you can't put other things over here on the left. It has to be there by itself, and then the calculation is on the right. Now, the second part of this should look a little more familiar. All right, this is what we've been doing. Document.getElementById, countNum.innerHTML, the number is, and then what we have here is called concatenation. Right? Or what I'm doing is I'm combining text and a variable. So I have this statement, the number is, which is regular text. And then what I'm doing is I'm combining that with the variable counter. So this isn't going to print out the word counter. It's going to print out the value being stored in counter. And then after I print out that value, I want to put a period to make it look like a sentence. So I have this plus sign here, and I continue on with what I'm saying. All right, so this is how I can mix and match regular text with variables. I'm saying, all right, the number is, now print out a variable, now go back to regular text. All right, if I didn't have any text at the end, I wouldn't need that plus sign at the end. I could just end it like this, and that would be fine. But since I'm continuing on with regular text, I need to have a plus sign at the end there. All right, if my variable was first, don't worry about that. We'll just keep it with text here. So my number is, and then we're combining the variable here, and then we've got this combining text here at the end. Counting down, pretty much the same exact thing. The only difference is instead of adding 1, we're subtracting 1. So counter equals counter minus 1. Document equals document.getElementById, countNum.innerHTML, the number is, and then again, we're just mixing text with a variable, which again we call concatenation. And here's the paragraph tag that's actually being modified. So all that's doing is, this is an empty tag at the start. It's filling in that empty tag with the message that we have written here. All right, the number is, and then we're printing out whatever value happens to be in that variable. All right, so the variable starts at 0, and then it goes up by 1 or down by 1. Now, when I made this variable, it was important that I put it up here at the top. All right, if I had put it down here inside of the function, we would have seen that our program wouldn't really work. All right, now watch what happens. All right, if I go back to my page here and I click count up, it continually tells me that the number is 1, right? No matter how many times I click on it. All right, and if I click count down, nothing even happens. All right, so what's going on here? All right, when I put the variable declaration here, every time I click on that button, this function counting up gets called. All right, so the very first thing that happens is this gets reset to 0. We add 1 to it, we print it out to the screen. If I click on the button again, it gets reset to 0. We add 1 to it, it gets printed out to the screen. So it's never able to be anything other than 1. Now, the reason the counting down didn't work is that when you create a variable inside of a function, it's called a local variable, which means it can only be used inside of that function. And if you try to use it outside of the function, it's not going to work. All right, so when I tried to use counter down here, it didn't work because this function doesn't have a variable called counter. All right, it only works up here because it has a variable called counter with set to 0. When I put it up top, it's what's called a global variable. All right, and when it's a global variable, any of the functions are allowed access to it, and any of the functions are allowed to use it, which is why counting up worked, which is why counting down worked, because they all had access to the variable since I created it outside of the functions. So you just have to be careful when you're making these that you put them in the right location. Sometimes you're going to want them inside the function. Sometimes you're going to want them outside the function. It depends on what you're doing. But for our purposes right now, we need them outside of our functions. All right. And again, now that I fixed all that, it should work again. And it does. All right. So example 1, we can use variables to keep track of things. We can modify those variables with simple addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, mathematical operations. Next, let's talk about this quick text function. So as of right now, the only thing that it does is display the word hi. So when I click on it, it displays the word hi. Give me a second. All right, so it displays the word hi. Let's see why that is. So here's my function quick text. This is the function that's getting called when I click on the button, because again, it has that on click quick text. What's happening? So inside of this, we have what's called an if-else tree, right? And we saw these in Excel when we strung together a whole bunch of if statements. So what's happening? We've got our if, all lowercase. We have our left and our right parenthesis. And then inside of that, we have a test. Now, what you'll notice is there's 2 equal signs here instead of 1 equal sign. All right. Here's the difference. 1 equal sign assigns a value. We're assigning 0 to a variable. We're setting the variable to 0. 2 equal signs is a test. We're checking to see if the variable has a 0 in it. We're checking to see if the variable has a 1 in it. All right. Instead of us setting the variable, we're checking the variable. So this if statement says, hey, if text counter equals 0, change the paragraph tag message to have the inner HTML hi. Else, if it's not 0, check to see if it has the value 1. All right. If it does, put out the message bye. Else, print out the message, how are you today? So we start by checking for a 0. If it's not 0, then we check to see if it's a 1. And if it's not a 1, this becomes our default. So notice, if we've got our parentheses, we have a test. Else if we have our parentheses, we have a test. Else is the default. Now, I could have as many else ifs as I wanted. So I could keep putting else ifs in as long as I wanted to. All right. And each one would have its braces and each one would have its own message. I could do that as much as I wanted to. Notice, though, when you get to the end, you have an else. All right. There's no if on the very last one, and there's no parentheses or test. This is sort of your default. This is, if nothing else is true, this is our default. This is our last option. All right. Now, when you set up one of these if-else trees, only one option ever runs. So if one of these is true, the others get totally skipped. If this one is true, the bottom one gets skipped. This only runs if none of the ones above are true, because we only ever get to do one. So if any of the other ones are true, we do that one and skip the rest. We only get down and do this last one if nothing else is true. So watch what happens if I change this variable. So text counter was 0, which is why I got the message 1. If I go here and change it to 1, all right, and now I click on it, it's going to say bye. All right, and it's just going to keep saying bye. Now, if I go up here and change it to 2, it's not 0, it's not 1, so I should get the message, how are you today? And if I click on it, it does give me that message. Now, if I go up here and change it to 2000, let's just change it to that. All right, it doesn't matter. That number is not 0, that number is not 1, so it should bring me back to the how are you today? And if I refresh this and I click on it, you're going to see that it does bring me to how are you today, because this last one is the default. All right, I could even go in the other direction. I could type in -10. Right? -10 is not 0, -10 is not 1, so it should give me the message, how are you today? And if I refresh this, oh, there it is. It's giving me the message, how are you today? Now, this is great, but most people aren't going to go in and change the code to get different messages. So what we're going to do is we're going to modify this so that it automatically changes each time. So we have this variable text counter, starts off at 0. So the first time they click on the button, this if statement is true, and we change the message to hi. What we're also going to do is we're going to change text counter and set it to 1. Now, when we set it to 1, it doesn't mean that this message is going to instantly pop up, because when you set up an if-else tree, only one of them gets to run. So the very first time we click on the button, this one runs, we put out the message hi, and we change the variable to 1. Now, the significance of that is the next time the button gets clicked, the variable is no longer 0, so we're going to skip this first one, and instead we're going to get to print out the second message. So watch what happens. I go back to the page, and I refresh it. Right? First time I click on it, I get hi. Now, the person using the site doesn't realize this, but the variable has been changed to 1. So the second time they click on it, it's now going to say bye. Now, if they click on it again, it's just going to say bye because we haven't changed the variable. But we can change the variable. We can go back in here and we can say, all right, when we set the word bye, let's also set the text counter to 2. Right? And if I save this, now when I refresh it, it says hi. The variable's been changed to 1. So the next time I click on it, it says bye. The variable's been changed to 2. So the next time I click on it, it's going to say, how are you today? But then I get stuck on how are you today? So if I want to create a loop so that it rotates between those three, I can go to this bottom one and say text counter equals 0, and that will loop me back up to the top. Right? When I get to this bottom one, that'll send me back to the top. So if I refresh this, it says hi. The variable's been changed to 1. It says bye. The variable's been changed to 2. It says how are you today? And the variable's been changed back to 0, so that when I click on it again, I get to hi, bye, how are you today? And then the loop just keeps repeating. All right, so this is how we can sort of use variables, one, to keep track of things and kind of have counts and calculations and stuff like that. But now our page can have some memory. All right, we can say, all right, this number 0 corresponds to hi. This number 1 corresponds to bye. This number 2 corresponds to how are you today? And we can check the current number, present the appropriate message, and then change the number to get a different message. All right, so it allows us to be even more reactive and dynamic with our web pages. So how does this all relate to you? All right, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be setting up two of these rotating type functions. All right, so this is going to be your template that you're going to be building around to set it up. Now, what are you actually setting up? You are going to be setting up, where is it? Right here, view current file in Chrome. You're going to be setting up a page that will, when they click on this change color button, rotate between different colors. So red, blue, green, red, blue, green, red, blue, green. And then when you click on the pictures, rotate between these different happy baby pictures. All right, so I feel like everybody has a different favorite. I'm fond of this one, and that one's pretty good, but they're both just so happy. I really don't know which one is the happiest. Maybe this one, but I don't know. That kid's pretty happy too. Yeah, it's just hard to tell. It's hard to tell which one's the happiest. So let's take a look at what you're actually going to be doing. So you've got this rotating file. All right. Inside of the rotating file, I've already set up the two functions for you. So there's a function called new color. There's a function called new pick. All right. When you click on the button, it calls new color. When you click on the picture, it calls new pick. All right. You are going to have to create two variables. So that means starting with the word var, coming up with a name, and giving it a starting value. And then inside both of these functions, you're going to be setting up the if statements that allow it to rotate between the different options. So it's going to be very similar to what we have here, only instead of changing the inner HTML, you're going to be changing the color, or you're going to be changing the picture. So when you're changing the background color, that's .style.background color. All right. When you're changing the picture, there's no .style. It's just .src. Now, quick word of reference. Sometimes kids think that this period is like part of the code. It's just the end of the sentence. Same thing here. This period is not part of the code. It's just the end of the sentence. So when you're writing your code, make sure you don't have that period at the end there. It also has, the document just has an example of one of these if-else trees. So again, you've got an example here. You've got the example we just did, but you're going to kind of use that as your guide to make it so that it rotates between the different colors and it rotates between the different pictures. Now, my advice is break the program down into steps. Don't try to do it all at once, because if you do, it becomes harder to find your mistakes. So new color, maybe you just start by trying to change the background color to red. And if you get that working, then start adding the if statements. Once you get one if statement working, then add the second one. Test that one. Make sure it works, then add the third one. Don't try to do it all at once, because then it becomes very difficult to find where your mistakes are. Also, a reminder, I talked about this last class, but when you have one of these up, you can hit F12 on your keyboard, all right, and then go to the console. And if you have mistakes, it'll give you an idea of where your mistakes are. All right, this one doesn't have any mistakes. This one doesn't have any mistakes, so there's nothing showing up right now. But in the console area, you will see an error message if you've got some mistake, and it'll tell you the line where the mistake is. Again, it's not always exact, but it can help you kind of narrow down where the problem is. But if you're testing it as you go, it should be easy to figure out where the problem is, because it's going to just be those last few lines that you were working on. All right, so best of luck. Obviously, let me know if you run into any problems or have any questions. But you should be in a pretty good place to do this, as long as you followed along and kind of set this up while watching the video. All right. Things to watch out for, these are regular parentheses. These are curly braces. Make sure you have those set up correctly. Again, these are regular parentheses. Be careful for your capitalizations. Most of the times when kids are making mistakes, because they have the wrong capitalization here. A lot of times they capitalize the I and the D, but it's just the I that's capitalized. So all these little things that you kind of have to look out for. Again, 2 equal signs is checking a value. 1 equal sign is setting a value. All right. So again, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll go from there. All right.